these get cemented in the ground 1.5 feet. And there's a hole gets drilled into here at the level of the dirt for electric wires. And they come up the inside and they come out the top, and there's a light fixture that sits on that tenon up on the very top.
You got to hold on to the center?
Yeah. So how do you get a drill bit to go 6.5 feet and stay on center? You don't. Unless it's a huge, I mean, that drill bit would have to have steel that big around not to move, you know. So, got me a picture. There it is. This is at the Iroquois Hotel, and they have a garden with pathways with lights. And so they want 10 of these because theirs are rotting off at the ground. And so when they got my price, they said 20 because I was too low. So the other thing I was really worried about was that this glue line would delaminate while I'm working on it. It would hit me with half a log. I didn't want to get hurt. So the first thing I did is turn the two ends. I turned the bottom end to 5 inches, and I turned the tenon on the top end, and I put a hose clamp on both of them. The second thing I did was turn for the center steady wheels in the middle, and that eliminated the span. So I was turning 4 feet on each side of the wheels. And that really helped with that odd balance business that was going on.
I don't know if it shows that or not. Where you turned it.
I had one of them was a video where it actually showed him spinning.
I didn't get it.
Not
So
that
this has been,
Yeah, those are the
this part has been
steadies.
turned right here to the,
Yeah, well, that one's just about done because the whole thing's nice and smooth.
Now, could you move the wheels up,
Yes, you can move the wheels.
I mean, up and down, spread them out a little bit?
Yes, you can do that too.
Okay.
Okay, so the next thing is, how do you get a log on the lathe? Because they're kind of heavy and they're awkward, and you can't be at both ends at the same time to stick it in the middle. So I have a winch for lifting heavy things on my lathe, and I put the fat end, which is the bottom down there, on the winch end, and the tenon, the top end would be on that end. So all I had to do was pick up the end that's on the floor, and it swung over the tool rest, and I set it down by the tailstock, went to the headstock and just bumped the winch a little till I was right on center, poked it in there, and then went to the other end and lifted it up and cranked up the tailstock, so I don't have to lift.
Steve, you might have mentioned this previously, but obviously it must be a custom-made lathe.
Yeah, it was made for me. It's about 1,500 pounds of steel. It's a good machine. And I needed the slow speed. It starts at about 20 RPMs, and that's where I started. So it's ka-chunk, 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 you know.
it's made for making salad bowls,
Yeah.
This isn't what the beginners.
for big parties. See, that is all
Do you have to
made.
worry at all with something that long of your speed at one end versus the other end?
Speed's the
It's gonna
same.
be the same?
The speed's the same, but what I've experienced is as you're taking the wood off here and here and here, all of a sudden, the center of the tree, the weight's different. It doesn't balance well. So even though you're getting closer to having the whole thing round, it starts shaking. Because the density's different, because you've cut through the center and you've taken sapwood off in some places, heartwood in other places. And so you would have to slow the lathe down. You'd think as you got closer and closer to being round, you'd speed it up. Just the opposite. Sometimes you had to slow it down because it was bouncing on the steady wheels in the middle. It changed, the whole thing is changing shape as you're working on it. So I sometimes had to really slow it down. And there's 3 wheelbarrows of shavings come off every one, more or less.
Wow.
Yeah. And these were the tools. This is a boat builder slick, and I used it as a skew chisel. Only one problem, knots. So every time you hit a knot with one of these, it's a little unnerving. But it does plane nicely. So most of the work was done with a bowl gouge, and a little bit of it was done with a roughing gouge if there weren't too many knots, because this thing takes a lot wider shaving than that does. And so These larger tools are what I've been using.
So roughing gouge, when it hits the knot, does that,
It really chunks bad.
Chunks, yeah.
Boom, like that, you know. And this other one, tick, 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 you know,
Yeah,
hits
okay.
a knot. So the smaller the shaving, the more forgiving it is hitting knots. You know, you're taking a big shaving, well, you're gonna really notice it.
See, why couldn't you slide that four-wheel steady in from the top?
Because the bottom wheel right here hits my tool rest. I have a continuous tool rest, and it would come right up and hit the bottom of the steel tool rest. Otherwise, it would work great. And I'd had to poke that long stick through it every time, you know, which was hard enough just getting it up there. So it's an unusual job, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody here, but
Well, that's just it. You look at it and it's just a simple post. Until you know,
yeah.
and I know what you've explained isn't even nowhere near what you went through.
Yeah, it's been the seat of the pants kind of thing.
I had several people that are asking me, and I kept pointing them towards, I said, that guy over there can tell you.
So there's my pole lamp, it comes down into one and then it has a base. The question is, how do you get wires to go to the two lamps in a crooked, you know, thing like that? So that's what I was faced with. So down here, first of all, I whittled it into, if you looked at it from underneath, I whittled it into a square. And the square went into a round. And then I mortised a square hole into this base so that when it glued in, and I put a wedge in it to expand it a little so it can't pull out with glue. But I started way down here with a Sawzall that way. Here's my Sawzall machine and here's the blade. I started way down here and I cut upward until the Sawzall blade came through like that. And then I just put a shorter blade in and continued my way up for both separately.
Oh, you're right, I can see it.
And then I laid the two wishbones out. I have pictures on my phone. And I just routed out the middle with a 1/4 inch round router bit and then glued them back together with the wires in there. And the wires came out the bottom. And then in the bottom of this disc, I routed out a space for an electrical box. A shallow electrical box where the two wires came in and the cord going to the wall came in and they're soldered together and, you know, nice lid on it. But it really wasn't that hard, Jim.
Yeah, I see it.
He
About
didn't have to
5-minute
feed the
job,
wire.
yeah.
He didn't feed the wire through.
Yeah, I routed out half the log and the wishbone and put it in there.
I kind of figured that, but I looked for the line.
One thing I ran into on those is I tried to get the routing done quickly because they'd been sliced lengthwise. And I guess you guys all know what happens to wood when it dries, at least I think you know. So if you take a log and there's the center and you split that log like this with a sawmill, the whole length of that log, you come back in about 2 weeks, that's what happens when it dries. Both of those two halves aren't going to be flat anymore because wood shrinks the most along the growth rings. There's the longest growth rings. These are shorter growth rings. So the main shrinkage, the longer the growth ring, the more it shrinks there. The shorter the growth ring, the less it shrinks. So I was running into that by the time I got to number 16 with the router. It was time to glue them back together. So then I just ran them through the joiner and reflattened the two sides before I routed. And it happened within about 3-4 days. So there was some moisture in those half logs. You know, they were, you know, peeled and in a huge pile, but you'll run into that. And Sam called me about a week ago, hey, I got some wood, how do I hold on to it the longest? I don't want it to split on me. And my advice to Sam was this: take a chainsaw and cut right there, the length of this thing. What do you suppose that'll look like when it dries?
open up?
Guess what that does for you? You still have a bowl here, you still have a bowl here. If you tried to dry that wood like this, it's going to get a split somewhere as it dries. You look at firewood, it's always split. and you never know where.